They called it mercy when the Alpha King chose her. Maren Mikkelsen thought it felt a lot more like a funeral. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a dead Omega, summoned to the great hall of Nordheim in the dead of winter with snow still in her hair and fear still in her throat. Around her, the crowd parted, not for her, but from her. The way wolves avoid something they do not understand. Lucas Tegan, Alpha King of Nordheim, stood at the altar. He was enormous, terrifying, iron-jawed and cold-eyed, his dark fur cloak dusted with snow. He had not smiled in 7 years. The elders said he had forgotten how. He looked at Maren once, just once, and then said, "She is the one." The hall erupted. Highborn she-wolves spat fury. Warriors laughed behind armored fists. Elders demanded an explanation, voices crashing over each other like ice flows on a river, each one louder and more outraged than the last. No one could understand why the most powerful alpha in 3 generations had chosen a nobody, a girl with no rank, no bloodline, no reason to be standing anywhere near a throne. Maren herself did not understand. Not until the wedding. Not until he opened the chest. Not until the whole town went silent. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. The Girl Nobody Wanted. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, which Maren would later remember as the last ordinary day of her life. She had been at the tannery since before dawn, same as every morning, crouched over the vats at the outermost edge of the Nordheim settlement, her hands raw from the salt brine, her hair tied back with a strip of old hide, her mind carefully and deliberately empty. That was the trick she had learned by the time she was 14. Do not think too far forward. Do not think too far back. Stay in the work. Stay in the cold. Stay in the animal smell of the hides and the muffled creak of the wooden frames and the particular gray quality of the pre-dawn light that made everything look the same. The dirt, the snowdrift, the rough walls of the workshop, so that nothing stood out and nothing had to be confronted. The tannery was where Maren had worked for the last 4 years, ever since old Breck had taken her on out of something that was not quite pity and not quite charity, more like the practical recognition that she was small enough to fit into the tightest stretching frames, quiet enough not to disturb the other workers, and desperate enough not to ask for much in wages. She was good at it. She had learned the salt curing, the bark soaking, the slow scraping of flesh from hide. She had learned to breathe through her mouth. She had learned not to flinch. She had learned a lot of things in the years since she stopped being Maren Mikkelsen, daughter of Eirik the Elder, and became simply Maren. No surname spoken aloud, no family name she could safely claim, a girl who existed in the margins of Nordheim the way a weed grows in the crack of a cobblestone, persistent, unwanted, and invisible to everyone who wasn't looking directly at her. She had been 7 years old when Nordheim was still a place she belonged to. She remembered that, in the way you remember something through water, blurred at the edges, uncertain at the center. She remembered her father's house, the carved lintel above the door, the smell of pine resin and tallow candles, her mother's voice reading the old stories aloud by firelight. She remembered being held. She remembered being known. Then she was 12, and her father was arrested on a charge of treason, the specifics of which were never clearly explained to her, only whispered around her, the way adults whisper about things they don't want children to understand. She remembered the guards coming. She remembered the door being broken off its hinges. She remembered watching from the top of the stairs as they dragged Eirik Mikkelsen away in irons, and how he had not looked back, not because he did not love her, she told herself, but because he had not wanted her to see his face. Her mother had been dead for 2 years by then, taken by a fever that the pack healers had not bothered to treat with much urgency, because they were a low family, an Omega line, and urgency was reserved for those with rank. What followed was the kind of childhood that did not build character so much as it stripped you down to bone. There were 3 years in the house of a distant cousin who resented her presence and made no secret of it. Meals left out of mealtimes, spaces in rooms that she was and was not permitted to occupy, a constant low-grade message delivered in the language of avoidance and contempt that said, "You are here because we must allow it, not because you are wanted." Then, At 15, she had aged out of even that marginal hospitality, and she had moved herself to the outermost ring of the settlement, where the tannery workers lived, and she had begun to make herself useful in the only way available to her. She had no wolf form, or so she believed. The shift came to pack wolves between the ages of 13 and 16, a first transformation that announced your wolf nature, your rank, the particular tenor of your power. For highborn wolves, the first shift was a ceremony, a celebration, attended by the whole pack with firelight and feasting. For lowborn wolves, it was quieter, more private, but no less significant. It was the thing that made you real, in Nordheim, the thing that confirmed you belonged. Marin's shift had never come. She had waited, year after year, through 17 and 18 and now 19, and nothing had happened. The pack healers, the ones she'd been able to get to speak to her, which was not many, had no explanation that they were willing to share with someone of her station. The whispers in the settlement said she was barren of wolf nature, a dud, a throwback, the omega line gone so thin it had finally run out. She had stopped arguing with the whispers a long time ago. She had stopped arguing with most things. The royal guard appeared at the tannery at 7:30 in the morning, when Marin was wringing out a soaked hide over a drain. There were two of them, tall, armored in the black and iron of the king's household guard, their cloaks bearing the wolf skull sigil of Nordheim's ruling line. They stood in the tannery doorway and looked around with the particular expression of people who had expected the place to be smaller and were finding it, instead, merely more pungent. Old Breck saw them first. He made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, the involuntary submission response that lower-ranked wolves made in the presence of high dominance, and then went very still in the way of someone trying not to be noticed. The guard on the left said, "Marin Mikkelsen." It was not a question. Marin straightened up slowly, still holding the hide, her hands dripping brine. Every person in the tannery was staring at her now, 5 workers, all of them her social equal or marginally above it, all wearing the same expression of confused, cautious relief that the guards had said her name and not theirs. "That's me," she said. The guard looked at her for a moment, at the linen dress, rough spun and worn to softness at the elbows, at the string-tied hair, at the brine-red hands, and his expression did not change. "The king requires your presence at the choosing this evening. You will be escorted to the preparation rooms at midday. Pack nothing of significance. You won't be there long." The tannery was absolutely silent except for the drip of brine hitting the stone floor. Marin said, "There must be a mistake." The guard said, "There is not." He said it with the absolute, unhurried certainty of someone who had been told this exact response would come and had been instructed to dismiss it without discussion. He produced a rolled parchment from inside his cloak. She could see the royal seal, dark red wax pressed with the Nordheim wolf skull, and even from a distance, she could feel the faint pulse of official power that radiated from it, the magic that bound the king's edicts to law, and held it out to her. She took it with her dripping hand. The parchment darkened at her fingers. "Midday," the guard said again, and then both of them turned and left, their armored boots loud on the tannery floor, and then they were gone. Marin stood holding the dripping parchment and the soaked hide and staring at the doorway. Old Breck cleared his throat. "Well," he said, in the tone of a man who has run out of useful things to say, "I suppose you'd best get cleaned up." She went. The choosing was held once in a generation, when the reigning Alpha King came of age or ascended to the throne and required a queen. It was, by ancient wolf law, a binding ritual. The Alpha King selected his mate in public, before the full assembled pack, and the selection could not be undone by any power short of death. The whole of Nordheim had been anticipating this one for 4 years, since Lucas Tegan had taken the throne at 22, young, severe, and already frightening in a way that made even the oldest warriors careful how they spoke around him. Every highborn she-wolf in the territory had been preparing. Daughters of warriors and elders and council members had been trained in court etiquette, presentability, political alliance. The betting among the pack had it as a close race between 2 women, Lena Strand, the Beta Lord Halvard Strand's beautiful, sharp-tongued daughter, and Freya Ulfric, eldest child of the most decorated general in Nordheim's army. Both of them were powerful. Both of them were ready. Both of them were, in every measurable way, exactly the kind of queen an alpha king was supposed to choose. Maren arrived at the great hall at midday, still smelling faintly of tannery brine despite her best efforts, and was immediately separated from the royal escort and brought to a side room where 3 women she had never met dressed her in a gown she had not been asked about. White linen, cleaner and finer than anything she owned, simple enough to look appropriate and plain enough to look exactly like what she was, and braided strips of white ribbon through her hair with the efficient, impersonal hands of people completing a task rather than attending to a person. No one told her why she was there. No one told her what was expected of her. She asked twice and received looks that ranged from bewildered to contemptuous, and after the second time, she stopped asking and stood very still and let herself be arranged. This was the skill she had developed most thoroughly in the years since her father's arrest, the capacity to endure being handled, not to enjoy it, not to accept it as her due, but to survive it without breaking, without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She had learned to go somewhere else in her head, a smaller, quieter room inside herself, while her body went through whatever was required of it. She went there now. The great hall, when she was led into it that evening, was overwhelming. She had never been inside it before. She had seen it from the outside, the stone face of it, the great carved doors, the banners snapping in the wind, but inside was something else entirely. The ceiling vaulted into darkness 30 feet above, hung with chains of torches that cast everything in amber and shadow. The floor was packed stone, worn smooth by centuries of boots and ceremony. The walls held trophies, weapons, pelts, the mounted skulls of wolves who had been enemies of Nordheim, arranged in rows that communicated their message without words. This is what happens to those who oppose us. The crowd was enormous. Every seat, every standing space, every narrow corridor between pillars was occupied by a wolf who ranked above her, which was to say, everyone in the room. She could feel the collective dominance of them like a pressure on her skin, the biological weight of 1,000 wolves whose power dwarfed hers. It should have felt crushing. It did feel crushing. She breathed through her mouth and kept her chin level and moved to where she was directed. She was placed at the far side of the hall, near a pillar, with no explanation and no further instruction. She stood there for nearly an hour while the ceremony unfolded around her, the formal presentations of the highborn candidates, each of them walking the length of the hall under the eyes of hundreds, their lineages announced by the head elder Gunnar in a voice that carried to every corner. She watched Lena Strand walk the hall with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a woman who had been born knowing she was wanted. She watched Freya Ulfric do the same, chin high, warrior's posture, absolute in her certainty. Maren watched them all and felt nothing in particular because none of this had anything to do with her. She was here by mistake. She would be sent home by nightfall. She would go back to the tannery and the brine and the gray light and the careful, deliberate emptiness, and none of this would have happened. Then the head elder's voice rang out across the hall. The Alpha King will now make his selection. Lucas Tegan stepped forward from the dais. She had seen him before. Everyone in Nordheim had seen him, because a king was not invisible, but up close, at the other end of this hall, he was different from what she had assembled in her mind. He was larger, for one thing. Not just tall, but built like the territory itself, broad-shouldered, dense with muscle, armored in black leather and dark fur that made him look like a piece of the winter landscape that had decided to stand upright and walk. His beard was dark, close-cropped, and his face had the particular quality of a man who had spent years in the company of war and cold weather and hard decisions, and had not found any of them pleasant, but had survived them all regardless. His eyes were gray, dark gray, like the sky before a storm decides what it's going to do. He stood at the edge of the dais and looked out over the assembled hall, and the room went very quiet. He didn't look at Lena Strand. He didn't look at Freya Ulfric. He didn't look at any of the prepared, presented, politically strategic women who had spent years angling for exactly this moment. He looked across the full length of the hall, past all of them, to the pillar at the far edge of the crowd. He looked at Maren. She felt it before she understood what it meant, a kind of gravity, like standing too close to the edge of something, like the ground had shifted an inch in a direction she didn't have a word for. His gaze was not warm. It was not cruel. It was simply absolute. The look of a man who had made a decision and was now completing the act of making it. Her, he said. One word, spoken quietly. And yet it landed in the hall like a stone through ice, and the silence that followed it was the stunned, disbelieving silence of an entire room that had heard something it could not process. Then, all at once, Nordheim erupted. She stood in the noise, the shouting, the fury, the disbelief crashing over her from every direction, and understood, with a cold and specific clarity, that her life had just ended. Or perhaps, that it had just begun. She wasn't sure in that moment which was worse. Chapter 2. Iron and Snow. They brought her to the altar through a corridor of wolves who did not bother to hide what they thought of her. It was not the shouting that stayed with Maren as she walked. The shouts were almost easier, because they were direct, and direction was something she knew how to meet. It was the quieter sounds, the hiss of breath drawn sharp between teeth, the low, contemptuous sound that was not quite a word, not quite a growl, that the she-wolves made as she passed, the sound of something being found unworthy and dismissed. A sound that said, "You do not belong here," in a register that went below language and lodged itself in the body, in the old animal part that still understood pack hierarchy the way a dog understands thunder. She had heard that sound before. She had learned not to let it show on her face. Her hands were folded at her belly, not in prayer, not in supplication, but in the way she had trained herself, over years of being in rooms where she was unwanted, to hold the parts of herself that wanted to shake. It looked like nervousness from the outside. From the inside it was armor. It was the physical act of gathering herself, of keeping the small, frightened, 19-year-old Maren who had been woken from a dreamless sleep at midday and dressed in someone else's white linen from flying apart in a room full of wolves who already hated her. She made it to the altar. Lucas Tegan was already there. Up close, closer than she had been in the hall, close enough to feel the ambient dominance heat that radiated from a king-class alpha like warmth from a hearth. He was even more incomprehensible than she had managed to assemble from a distance. He was simply not built at the human scale of things. His shoulders were wide enough to block her view of the dais behind him. The fur cloak across them was dark wolf pelt, ancient and heavy, pinned at the shoulder with a brooch in the shape of a snarling wolf's head. His armor beneath it, black leather, iron riveted, was not ceremonial. It was the armor of a man who wore it because he was always, on some level, at war. He was holding the chest. She had not fully registered it in the chaos of the hall. She had seen it, peripherally, an object in his hands, but she had been too occupied with not visibly falling apart to examine it. Now, this close, it was impossible to look at anything else. It was iron, not ornamental iron, not the decorative kind shaped to impress, but old iron, the kind that had been in the world long enough to take on a patina, so deep it looked almost organic, like the outside of something alive. The chest was roughly the size of a large book, its surface covered in carvings so fine and dense that from a distance they looked like texture rather than design. At the seams, where the lid met the body of the chest, there was light, orange gold, faint but unmistakable, pulsing with the slow rhythmic quality of something breathing. She could feel it from 2 feet away, a warmth, and beneath the warmth something older, a resonance, a vibration below the threshold of sound, the way you feel a great bell even when you cannot hear it ringing. It moved in her chest like an echo. She looked up at Lucas. He was looking at her face, specifically, with an attention that was not warm and not unkind, and not anything she could easily name. He was watching her reaction to the chest the way a man watches an experiment he already knows the outcome of. She did not look away. She had made, years ago, the decision to never be the first to look away. Around them, the hall was still in chaos, Halvard Strand's voice carrying above the crowd, demanding explanation, demanding precedent, demanding the Alpha King explain himself, by what authority and by what possible rationale, and the head Elder Gunnar trying to impose order on a room that had no interest in order, and the warriors murmuring among themselves, and the highborn she-wolves who had expected to be standing where Maren was standing, making sounds of outrage that ranged from the political to the personal. Lucas Tegan paid none of it any attention whatsoever. He stepped closer to her, not crowding, but deliberate, and held the chest out slightly, not to give it to her but to place it between them, like a thing being acknowledged. "Open it at the ceremony," he said. His voice was low, pitched for her alone, barely audible over the din, not before. "Not in this room. Not in private. At the ceremony, in front of the full court. You open it." A pause. "Do you understand?" She understood the words. She did not understand anything else. "Why me?" she said. It was a stupid question under the circumstances. It was also the only question that mattered. It was the question that had been building in her chest since the moment he had looked at her across the hall. The particular helpless bewilderment of someone who has spent their entire life being invisible and has suddenly, without warning or preparation, been looked at by the most powerful pair of eyes in the territory. He studied her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, a calculation, a decision, and she had the strange sense that he was choosing not how much to tell her, but rather exactly which true thing to say. "Because you're the only one who can carry what is in that chest," he said. Before she could respond, before she could ask what that meant, or push back, or demand the explanation she deserved, he turned to the court and raised his voice to something that cut through the chaos like an axe through wood. "She will be my queen," he announced. "The ceremony is in 3 days. The choosing is complete." The hall erupted again. Halvard Strand was on his feet, face darkened with fury, his daughter Lena standing behind him with an expression that had gone past anger into something colder and more careful. The head Elder Gunnar was trying to speak, his old voice cracking under the strain of projecting over the noise. Warriors were arguing at the sides of the hall. A group of highborn she-wolves near the back had begun a counter-declaration that had something to do with precedent and bloodline requirements. Maren stood at the altar with the iron chest at her feet and the snow smell of Lucas Tegan still in her nose, and the particular cold thud of someone who has just had their life changed without being consulted about it. She looked down at the chest. The light pulsed at its seams, slow and steady as breathing. She thought, "I have no idea what is happening to me." Then she thought, "I am not going to let any of them see that." She straightened. She unfolded her hands from her belly and let them hang at her sides, loose, deliberate. She lifted her chin to the angle she had perfected over years, the angle that said, "I am not afraid of you," which was a lie, but a lie she had told so many times it had begun to feel like a truth she was building toward. The wolves around her seethed and shouted and radiated their contempt in waves she could feel on her skin. She stood in the center of it and did not move. Later, much later, after the guards had escorted her from the hall, after the preparations had begun, after she had been installed in a room in the king's stronghold that was larger than any room she had ever slept in and colder in its splendor than the tannery had ever been in its squalor, she sat on the edge of a stone-flagged hearth with the iron chest in her lap, and she ran her fingers over the carvings on its surface. In the torchlight of the room, she could see them more clearly than she had in the hall. They were letters. Not the common script that Nordheim used for trade and law that she could read, had taught herself at 12 by stealing discarded documents from the pack council's waste, but something older, narrower, more intricate, the strokes of it precise and deliberate in a way that spoke of a language that had been designed to last. She knew the script. The knowledge arrived in her chest with the particular dissonance of a thing that has been locked away for a long time and suddenly surfaces, like a word in a dream that you can read but cannot explain. She knew this script because her father had taught it to her on winter evenings when the fire was low and the world outside was too cold to consider, when he would take out his old papers and call it a game. The old language. The first tongue, he had called it. Letters that the first pack had used 200 years ago before Nordheim was Nordheim. He had taught her the shapes of them the way other parents teach songs, with repetition and warmth, with the specific care of someone preserving something fragile. She had thought it was a game. She had thought it was just her father's eccentricity, his love of history, his way of giving her something to hold on to that was their own. Now she traced the letters on the chest and felt them under her fingers like a pulse, and the sound they made in her mind was not quite language, and not quite music, and not quite grief, and she did not open the chest, because he had told her not to, and she could not have said, even to herself, whether it was obedience or fear or something else entirely that kept her hand still. She sat with it until the fire burned low. She did not sleep. Chapter 3. A Queen in a Cage. The king's stronghold had 47 rooms. Maren knew this by the end of her second day because she had walked all of them, mapping it with the careful, systematic attention of someone who had learned that knowing the shape of a space was the first and most important defense against being ambushed in it. Not ambushed by violence, though that was not a risk she had ruled out entirely. Ambushed by humiliation. By the particular small cruelties that the powerful performed on the powerless in spaces where no one of consequence was watching. She had spent years reading the topography of rooms for exits and danger, and she applied this skill now to a stronghold that was so far outside her previous experience that it might as well have been a foreign country. The room she had been given was on the 3rd level, stone-walled, high-ceilinged, heated by a fireplace large enough to stand in. There was a bed with actual linens, a chest for clothing, a narrow window that looked out over the northern wall of the settlement to the tree line, and beyond that to the mountains, which in the gray winter light looked exactly like what they were, the edge of the world. There was a washstand with a ceramic basin, which she had used with careful reverence. There was a rug on the floor, thick and dark, that her bare feet had discovered in the middle of the night, and which she had stood on for a full minute before she could bring herself to move. She owned almost nothing. She had come with what she was wearing. They had let her keep the white linen dress, or rather they had not yet brought her anything else, and the habit of owning almost nothing meant that the room, with its unfamiliar comforts, felt less like a gift and more like a space she was being tested in. She moved through it carefully, touching nothing that she hadn't established a reason to touch. Her handmaiden arrived on the morning of the second day. Her name was Sigrid, and she was perhaps a few years older than Maren, 22, 23, with a round face and copper-colored hair and the particular quality of uncomplicated directness that Maren associated with people who had grown up in environments where directness was safe. She arrived with a breakfast tray, set it down on the table by the window, and said, "Good morning.
I'm Sigrid.
I've been assigned to you as lady's maid. I know the stronghold well, and I'll answer any question you have honestly, including the ones you're probably afraid to ask." Maren looked at her for a moment.
Who assigned you? She said.
"The king," Sigrid said, and then, anticipating the next question, "He gave me 3 instructions. Keep you informed.
Keep you safe.
Don't treat you like you don't belong here." She set out the breakfast with efficient, unhurried hands. "I intend to follow all 3. It was the 3rd instruction that lodged in Maren's chest and stayed there for the rest of the morning. She ate breakfast for the first time in 2 days, real food, warm food, bread and cured meat and something sweet that she could not identify but ate all of, and Sigrid told her, between the practical details of the stronghold's layout and daily schedule, the things that Maren actually needed to know. The geography of power in the king's court. Who mattered? Who had influence? Who was watching her, and for what reason? "The head elder Gunnar is the one you need to worry about most," Sigrid said, settling into the chair across the table with the easy familiarity of someone who had already decided they were going to be friends, whether or not Maren had agreed to it. "He doesn't shout. He doesn't threaten. He simply makes things difficult for people he has decided are problems. He made the last visiting clan's delegates' tenure so administratively impossible that the man left in the middle of winter, which if you know what winters are like here," she gestured at the window and the mountains and the general gray enormity of the Nordheim landscape. "He will be watching for any reason to have you declared unsuitable." "What would that require?" Maren said. "Officially, evidence of low birth compromising the bloodline requirements for queenship. The wolf law on this is complicated and very old, and most of it hasn't been tested because no Alpha King in memory has ever chosen anyone close to as low-ranked as you." Sigrid said this without unkindness, The way you say a fact is a fact. Unofficially, Gunnar decides what constitutes evidence. He's been doing this for 40 years. He's very good at it. Maren considered this. And Halvard Strand? Sigrid's expression changed, not dramatically, but a careful neutrality descended over it the way a shutter closes over a window. Halvard Strand is the Beta Lord. He commands the second largest army in Nordheim. He controls 3 settlement councils and has political alliances in 2 neighboring territories. He was expecting his daughter to be chosen. I see. He's also, Sigrid said, not someone who accepts disappointment without response. There was a pause. Maren thought about the note that had arrived that morning, slid under her door before she was awake, written in a hand she did not know on paper that smelled faintly of pine resin and power. You do not belong here. Leave willingly, and I will ensure your safety. Stay, and I cannot promise the same.
No signature.
None needed. She had burned it in the fireplace before breakfast. I'll keep that in mind, she said. She explored the stronghold that afternoon in the way she explored everything, methodically, paying attention, cataloging what she found. The public rooms on the lower levels were all stone and firelight, and the heavy, antler-hung aesthetic of a place that had been built for function and had acquired decoration only incidentally, over centuries of people adding things to walls, and then dying, and leaving those things there. The war room was on the second level. She had not gone in, but she had looked through the open door and seen the maps spread across the central table, the pins and markers of a military strategy she could not read from the doorway. The 2 senior advisors in hushed conversation that stopped when they registered her presence and did not resume until she had moved on. The kitchens were in the lower level, vast and smelling of wood smoke and rendered fat. The training yard was behind the main building, and through a window on the second level she had watched the King's Guard going through their morning forms, the controlled, brutal efficiency of it, the way they moved like a single organism with 40 separate parts, and had stood at the window perhaps a few seconds longer than she'd meant to, because it was oddly beautiful, the way violence in practice often was. She had not seen Lucas Tegan except once. It was at dinner on the second evening, the formal kind, in the great hall on the main level, where she had been placed at the far end of the long table from him, surrounded by advisors and lesser court members who alternated between ignoring her and examining her with a covert, assessing looks that wolves gave things they had not classified yet. She had sat very still and eaten what was put in front of her and said almost nothing, which was not difficult because almost no one spoke to her. Lucas was at the head of the table, surrounded by his war council, speaking in low tones about something she couldn't hear. He did not look at her. Then, midway through the meal, in the pause between 2 courses, he did. Just a glance, a fraction of a second, a flicker of those dark gray eyes down the length of the table. She could not read what was in it. Not warmth, not cruelty, not the cold assessment that he'd given her at the choosing. Something else. Something that might have been, if she had been a different kind of girl in a different kind of situation, attention. She looked away first. The old rule, the survival rule. Never hold the gaze of someone whose good opinion you need and haven't earned. Then she looked back at her plate and thought, but I didn't look away because I was afraid. I looked away because I chose to. And that small distinction, chosen rather than compelled, was the first thing in 2 days that had felt, in some minor key, like power. The ceremony was in 2 days. She had 2 days to become something that could walk into that hall without flinching. She finished her dinner. She went back to her room. She sat with the chest on her lap and the firelight warm against her face, and traced the old letters with her fingers, reading the fragments she could decipher, and thought about what kind of woman she wanted to be when this was over. Not the woman she had been. That woman had survived. But surviving and living were not the same thing, and she had known that for a long time without being able to name it. The chest pulsed its low, warm pulse against her hands. She would figure it out. She had figured out worse. Chapter 4. What the chest remembers. She found him at midnight. She had not meant to. She had been awake. Sleep was not something she'd been able to reliably find since the choosing, walking the corridors of the stronghold in the way she'd taken to walking it, learning its geography, when she had passed the war room door and found it open and lit, and through it the king bent over his maps at the central table alone. One hand braced on the table's edge, and the other moving across a map with the concentrated intentionality of a man conducting a private argument with the territory. She should have kept walking. She was aware of this even as she stopped. The thing that stopped her was the chest. Not the physical chest. She had left it in her room, but the script on its surface, which had been running through her mind since she'd first read it 2 nights ago, resolving and dissolving in the way of a code you're on the edge of cracking. The sense that the answer was just there, one more connection away, if she could only hold the right pieces in the right order. She knocked on the open door. Lucas looked up. The expression he made when he saw her was not what she had expected, which was coldness, or dismissal, or the studied blankness he wore in court. Instead, he made the particular expression of a man who has been doing a difficult thing alone for a long time and has unexpectedly been interrupted, which is a specific cocktail of relief and annoyance that most people would identify as irritation and a careful observer would identify as something else. He said nothing. He waited. She said, "I know the script on the chest." A pause. He straightened up slightly.
Come in.
She came in. The war room was smaller than the hall but larger than any space she'd been alone in with another person for a long time, and it smelled of pine resin and candle tallow and, faintly, beneath those, the iron and leather smell of the man standing at the table. The maps spread across it were detailed and annotated. She registered, with the automatic pattern recognition of someone who had spent years reading documents they weren't supposed to, that the annotations were in at least 3 different hands. A council's work. A king's problem. She crossed to the table, not too close, and said, "The script on the chest is first pack script. The old tongue, the written language of Nordheim's founding pack, before the Second Council reformed the alphabet. It hasn't been in common use for about 2 centuries.
She paused.
I can read fragments of it. My father taught me the letters." Lucas had gone very still. It was not the stillness of someone doing nothing. It was the stillness of someone containing a significant reaction. "What can you read?" he said. She recited from memory. She had always had a good memory, the kind that comes from having grown up in an environment where you couldn't write things down. The first line on the lid reads, roughly, "What is hidden shall be found by the one to whom it belongs." The second line, the longer one running around the base, I can only get fragments of. Something about blood. Something about the right of return. There's a phrase near the locking mechanism that I think means carried through fire and time, but I'm not certain. The verb tense in first pack script is different from modern Nordheim, and I may be misreading the contextual marker. There was a silence that had more texture than most silences. "Where did your father learn it?"
Lucas said.
He called it the old game. He said he'd had it from his own father, who'd had it from his. She looked at him. "He taught me in winter, when there wasn't much else to do. I thought it was just his love of old things. He loved old things." Something moved in her throat. She steadied it. "I thought it was meaningless." Lucas moved from behind the table. Not toward her. He stopped at the edge of the map, a safe distance, and turned to look at her directly, and she saw the things she had seen briefly at the choosing, and then not again until now. The recognition. The look of a man placing a piece in a puzzle that has been incomplete for a very long time. "It was not meaningless," he said. "What was it?" He was quiet for a moment, that same quality of choosing which true thing to say.
"Then, your father knew what was in the chest, Maren."
"He knew because it was his to keep. And he taught you the language that unlocks it because he was preparing you for a moment he knew would come, even if he could not tell you when or how." The room was very quiet. Through the high window, snow was falling in the darkness outside, steady and absolute, the kind of snowfall that made the world feel sealed. "My father was arrested for treason," she said. Her voice was level. She had practiced keeping it level on this subject. "He was executed when I was 12. She stopped. Started again. He was found guilty of stealing sacred relics from the first Pax vault. That is the official record." "I know what the official record says." "Is it true?" Lucas looked at her. In the candlelight his face was stripped of its court armor, no audience, no performance, just the hard-boned, tired face of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. "No," he said. "It is not true. What happened to your father was a crime. And the men who committed it are still in this court, still holding power, and still believing they got away with it. She had been braced for this answer. She realized, had been bracing for it since the moment he had chosen her, some part of her mind working the problem beneath the surface of the shock and bewilderment. Even so, hearing it said aloud, in the flat, certain voice of a man stating an established fact, made something crack open in the center of her chest. She did not cry. She had taught herself not to cry years ago, on the principle that tears were something that had to be earned back from the people who had caused them, and she was not prepared to give Halvard Strand that. But she breathed, carefully, deliberately, the way you breathe when you are holding something heavy. "Go to sleep, Maren," Lucas said quietly. "There will be time for the rest of this." She looked at him. You know everything, don't you? What's in the chest, what it means, what my father was."
She paused.
"You've known for a long time." He held her gaze. "Yes. And you didn't tell me at the choosing because the hall was full of Halvard Strand's eyes and ears, and the chest needed to be opened before witnesses who could not deny what they saw. Because if I had told you in private, the truth could be dismissed as manufactured." Because he stopped. The line of his jaw shifted. "Because I needed you to walk into that hall as yourself. Not as someone who had been told who she was and might perform it. As yourself." She stood with this for a moment. Then, "That is either very strategic or very arrogant." "Both," he said, and something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, barely a softening, but something, and she filed it away without letting anything show on her face. "How long have you known?" she said.
3 years, he said.
"Since I took the throne and opened the sealed records that my predecessor had locked." A pause. "You were 16. You were working at the tannery. I had you watched, not to surveil, to protect, because the people who destroyed your father would have destroyed you if they had known what you were." 3 years. He had known for 3 years and kept her safe from a distance and said nothing, and she had spent those 3 years invisible at the edge of the settlement, convinced she was nothing. She thought about what to say to that. She came up with nothing adequate. They moved through the rest of the morning at a pace that surprised them both, not because Astrid was going easy on her, but because Maren was genuinely fast, and the material, once it made sense, was not difficult to hold. The politics she absorbed like water into dry ground, the ceremony she committed to muscle memory through repetition, and by midday she had a functional, if not fluent, working knowledge of the court she was about to enter. The afternoon was different. The council session was called without warning, a formal gathering of the senior advisors and elder pack members in the Great Hall, convened ostensibly to finalize the ceremonial arrangements for the following day, but serving, Maren understood within 5 minutes, as an opportunity for Halvard Strand's allies to make one last formal objection to her inclusion. She had not expected to attend. Sigrid had come to her room with the message, the King's Chamberlain, requesting her presence at the council, and Maren had gone, because the alternative was to remain in her room, and that was exactly what Halvard Strand wanted her to do. The hall was cold and full, a dozen senior advisors, for pack elders including Gunnar, 3 representatives of allied settlements who had come for the ceremony, and Halvard Strand himself, who occupied his chair at the lower end of the council table with the particular settled authority of a man who had been the most important person in most rooms for a very long time. Lucas was at the head of the table. He did not look at her when she entered. He did not acknowledge her presence at all, which she understood. She was learning, quickly, his particular language of strategic distance, as its own kind of message. Behave as though you belong here, because you do. She took the indicated chair beside Astrid and sat still and listened. The objection, when it came, was made by an elder named Varg, a thin, papery man with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades making arguments on behalf of people with more power than principle. He cited, with considerable detail and the kind of lawyerly thoroughness that was clearly intended to be as dull as it was devastating, 3 sections of wolf law pertaining to the bloodline requirements for a queen's consort. He cited the precedent of the Third Alliance Council's ruling on the matter of the Ragnar lineage compromise. He cited, with some relish, the specific statutory language around what constituted a disgrace line and the implications thereof. He was good at it. Maren sat and listened and felt the room tipping, degree by degree, away from her. Then Varg made a citation error. It was subtle. The misquotation of a case reference, the kind of error that would be invisible to anyone who had not spent the morning memorizing Wolf Law, and he made it with the confidence of a man who did not expect to be corrected in this room by this person. Maren said, "That's not correct." The room turned to look at her. Halvard Strand's expression moved through surprise and into something colder. She said calmly, "The Elder cited the Third Alliance Council ruling as precedent for bloodline disqualification in cases of treason conviction. But the Third Alliance ruling actually pertains to voluntary rank renunciation, not criminal conviction. The applicable precedent for conviction cases is the Thorvald Amendment, which was specifically enacted to prevent political persecutions from being used to disqualify bloodlines retroactively. Under the Thorvald Amendment, a conviction in absentia, which my father's was, since he died before his appeal could be heard, is not binding for the purposes of lineage status." She had memorized this from Astrid's documents that morning. She had not known, when she memorized it, that she would use it today. She had memorized it because she memorized everything, because you never knew which wall was going to hold. The room was very quiet. Lucas Tegan, at the head of the table, had his head slightly turned. She could not see his expression. Elder Varg had the look of a man who has been corrected accurately and is deciding how to respond. Halvard Strand said, very softly, "Interesting." It was the most dangerous thing he had said. Not the shouting in the hall, not the note under the door. This single word, in that tone, was the thing that meant he had recalibrated. Maren met his eyes, just briefly, just long enough to be deliberate, and then returned her attention to the council. The rest of the session passed without incident. Afterward, when the hall had emptied and she was in the corridor reaching for her cloak against the cold that poured through the stone walls, she felt a weight settle across her shoulders and stopped, startled. It was a fur cloak, dark wolf pelt, heavy and warm, the kind of garment that belonged to someone with rank. She turned. Lucas was already walking away. He had not said anything. He had simply, without announcement or explanation, placed it on her shoulders and continued moving, as if he had done nothing at all. She stood in the corridor holding the cloak around herself and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, warm. Chapter 6. The Weight of Halvard's Shadow. The rumor arrived, as all political weapons did, sideways. It was not declared in court. It was not made officially. It moved through the stronghold the way poison moves through water, invisible until it was in everything, and by the time Sigrid brought it to Maren on the morning before the ceremony, it had already saturated 3 council chambers and the private dining rooms of 2 senior advisors. The rumor was this: Maren's father, Eirik Mikkelsen, had not merely been convicted of treason. He had stolen from the sacred First Pack vault, not documents, not correspondence, but physical relics, the ceremonial objects held by the founding bloodline since Nordheim's establishment, items so ancient and so bound in pack law that their theft was not just a crime but a desecration. And not merely any relics. The rumor specified, with a detail that only comes from a source who wants to be believed, the founding genealogy, the blood-sealed lineage scroll, and the first queen's ceremonial mantle. The implication was deliberate and precise. Maren did not come from a disgraced line. She came from a stolen one. The tokens that Lucas intended to present at the ceremony, whatever was in the chest, were themselves stolen goods, and any claim they supported was built on theft and sacrilege. Under Wolf Law, a queen could not be crowned from a lineage that had desecrated the sacred. It was one of the oldest statutes in the code. Sigrid told her in the morning, setting it out plainly in the way she had established as her method. No softening, no omissions, all the information available, and then waiting. Maren sat at the table with her tea and her hands flat on the wood and felt the thing the rumor was designed to produce, a cold, specific despair, the sensation of the ground being cut from beneath your feet, and she felt it for approximately 2 minutes, and then she set it aside. "Where did it come from?" she said. Sigrid looked at her with something that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration. Halvard's network. It's been in motion since yesterday afternoon.
He's smart, Marin said.
He didn't use the legal argument directly because I already countered the legal argument in the council. So he moved to the factual foundation. If the relics are stolen, the legal argument becomes moot because the entire provenance is contaminated. She turned her teacup in her hands. He's framing it so that even the chest becoming proof of my lineage becomes evidence of my father's crime. Sigrid was quiet for a moment. Then, most people, when they hear they've been targeted by Halvard Strand, spend a minute falling apart before they start strategizing. I had my 2 minutes, Marin said. She asked to see the king. He received her in the war room. She was beginning to think of it as his actual space, in the way that the throne room and the great hall were ceremonial spaces, and the war room was where Lucas Tegan actually lived, and he did not look surprised to see her, which she was starting to suspect he never did. He had a quality of perpetual preparedness that was either impressive or exhausting, depending on the day. She told him what she knew. Then she said, I need you to tell me the truth about my father. All of it. Not what you decide I'm ready to hear. Everything. Lucas looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze and did not look away, and this time it was not a performance. He sat down across the table from her. The first time she had seen him sit in her presence, which she noted because everything he did communicated something and she was learning his language, and he told her. Eirik Mikkelsen had been the last living keeper of the first pack bloodline. Not its member, its keeper. A role established 200 years ago when the last first pack queen had hidden her heir to protect them from a coup, entrusting the physical proof of the bloodline, the genealogy scroll, the founding mantle, the sealed chest, to a loyal family line whose duty was to guard these objects until the bloodline heir could be safely revealed. The Mikkelsen family had kept this trust for 7 generations. The coup that had originally necessitated the hiding had left descendants in Nordheim's court, families who had profited from the erasure of the first pack line and who, if the true heir were ever revealed, would lose everything. Halvard Strand's family was among them. Not the man himself. He had not been born when it happened, but the wealth and position his family held were built on what had been stolen from the first pack bloodline. When Eirik Mikkelsen had begun making quiet inquiries, searching for the right moment to reveal his daughter's lineage safely, Halvard's father had discovered what he was doing. The treason charge had been manufactured. The relics had been declared stolen to contaminate any future claim. Eirik Mikkelsen had been executed before his appeal could be heard, and his daughter had been hidden in plain sight as a nobody, too low-ranked for anyone to look at closely. Marin sat with this for a long time. She thought about her father teaching her the old script by firelight, calling it a game. She thought about the way he had always been careful, not afraid, but careful, and how she had understood that carefulness as a child, as a personality trait rather than a necessity. She thought about the fact that he had always known what she was, and had been trying to prepare her for it in the only safe way available to him, and had died before he could finish. She was not going to cry. She had already decided this. He was protecting me, she said. Yes, Lucas said. He knew they might come for him, and he kept the relics safe and taught me what I needed to know and never told me directly because telling me directly would have put me in danger. Yes. And the chest has been sealed because only the true heir of the first pack bloodline can open it. That's what the script says. What is hidden shall be found by the one to whom it belongs. She looked at him. You brought it to me because you knew I was the one who could open it. And you're opening it at the ceremony in front of Halvard and the full court because once it opens for me, in public, the evidence inside is irrefutable. Yes. And Halvard's rumor is an attempt to poison the well before the chest opens. If he can establish in people's minds that the relics are stolen, then even when the chest opens, some of them will look for a way to dismiss it. Which is why, Lucas said, you need to walk into that ceremony tomorrow as yourself. Not performing. Not defended. Just yourself. He paused. Because the evidence in the chest is irrefutable, but evidence alone is not what changes minds in a room full of people who have invested in a story. What changes minds is standing in front of them and being exactly what you are undeniably, so that when the chest opens and confirms it, the only response available is to kneel. She held his gaze. You've thought about this for 3 years. I've thought about this for 3 years. Have you ever been wrong about something this significant?
A pause. Once, he said.
Early in my reign. I won't tell you what it was, but I paid for it in ways I don't intend to repeat. She stood up from the table. Her hands, she noticed, were steady.
Tell Gunnar, she said.
Tell him about the Halvard rumor, today, officially. I want the counter-record in place before the ceremony. Not the full truth. We saved that for the chest. But the Thorvald amendment on the record, so that Halvard's legal strategy is dead before it starts. Lucas looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to learn was his version of respect. Not warm, not demonstrative, but absolutely present. It's already done, he said. She had nodded and left, and she had walked the corridors back to her room with a fur cloak around her shoulders and her father's voice in her memory saying, "The old game, Maren. Let me show you the letters." She understood now what it had been. Not a game at all.
Love.
The only kind he had known how to give safely. Chapter 7. The night before. She found Sigrid on the floor of the preparation room. It was evening, the eve of the ceremony. The sky outside the narrow windows a deep indigo that was turning to black. The torches lit throughout the stronghold, casting everything in the warm amber light that felt, in the run-up to any significant event, slightly unreal. Maren had gone to find Sigrid with a question about the next morning's timing, a small, practical question, the kind she had started to rely on Sigrid for, because Sigrid knew everything about the stronghold's rhythms and could answer without making her feel like she should have already known. She had knocked on the preparation room door and received no answer, and then pushed it open, and found Sigrid crumpled at the base of the cabinet where the morning's ceremonial materials were stored, unconscious, her color wrong, her breathing too shallow. Maren was across the room in 2 seconds. She took Sigrid's wrist, pulse present, but slow and unsteady, and checked her airway and put her in the recovery position the way her father had taught her, years ago, from an old healer's text that he'd acquired somewhere and kept on the shelf above the fire. She had not known learning that, what she was learning it for. She was learning it for this. "Stay with me," she said to Sigrid, uselessly, because Sigrid could not hear her. "Stay with me." She got the healer in under 3 minutes, shouting for the guard in the corridor and using the particular tone, sharp, flat, carrying that she had found, in these last few days, cut through deference and protocol the way a blade cuts through wool. The healer came. The healer identified, quickly and with the focused efficiency of someone accustomed to trio, that Sigrid had been given something. Not enough to kill, precisely calibrated not to kill, and that she would recover, and that the vehicle had been her evening tea. Her evening tea, which had been delivered, as always, from the kitchen. The kitchen that served the whole stronghold. The healer stabilized Sigrid and moved her to the healer's rooms. Maren stood in the empty preparation chamber and looked at the overturned cup on the floor and felt the things settle into place. The calculation behind the act, the message it was meant to deliver. This is a warning. The next message will be worse. She went to her room. She sat on the floor beside the hearth, not because the floor was comfortable, but because she had always thought better close to the ground. Some old animal instinct, perhaps, or simply the habit of a person who had spent years in rooms where chairs were not available to her. She had the chest in her lap. It was warm against her thighs, its carved surface familiar under her fingers now, and its light steady and patient at the seams. She thought about running. She had run before, not physically, but in the more significant sense. She had removed herself from situations, had contracted down to nothing, had made herself so invisible and so undemanding that there was nothing left to target. It had worked in the way that very small lives work. She had survived. She had stayed below the threshold of harm by staying below the threshold of significance. She could do that now. She could leave tonight, not because Halvard had frightened her into it, but as a choice. A reasoned withdrawal. She could go back to the tannery and the brine and the gray light and the careful, deliberate emptiness, and no one would follow her there, because no one had ever followed her there. She had been nothing before. She could be nothing again. She sat with this for a long time. The fire burned. The chest pulsed its slow warmth against her hands. Outside the window, snow was falling. She could hear it, the the particular silence of heavy snowfall, the way it muffled the world and made everything feel sealed. Her father had taught her the old letters by firelight. He had done it carefully, patiently, over years, repeating the shapes with her, correcting her mistakes without impatience, telling her it was a game. He had never once told her why. He had carried that alone, because telling her would have made her a target, and he had loved her in the particular anguished way of parents who must choose between truth and safety, who choose safety and spend the rest of their lives hoping they made the right call. He had died before he could find out. She was not going to run. She had known this, actually, before she sat down on the floor. She had known it when she put Sigrid in the recovery position, when she got the healer, when she stood in the preparation room looking at the overturned cup. There was a version of Maren who ran and a version who didn't, and she had been choosing, incrementally for the last few days, without fully acknowledging it, which version she was becoming. The fur cloak on her shoulders, the corrected citation in the council, the steady hands. She was not that girl anymore. Or she was still, in all the ways that mattered, the girl who endured, who survived, who was made of patience and observance and the particular hard intelligence of someone who has had to teach themselves everything, but she was also something else now, something that had been there all along, beneath the surface, too long submerged. She heard the door. She did not startle. She had heard his footsteps before she heard the door, had registered the particular weight and rhythm of them from 2 corridors away, because she had been paying attention to this building's sounds for days, and his footsteps were one of the things she had learned. He came in without knocking, which was technically his right in any room of his own stronghold, and when he saw her on the floor, he stopped. He looked at her. The floor, the chest, the fire, and his expression did not change, but she had been learning his face well enough by now to read the things that weren't changes. The slight widening of attention, the almost fractional easing around the eyes that was not warmth, but was its precursor. He sat beside her. Not close. There was a foot of floor between them, but beside her, on the cold stone, without ceremony or explanation, and he stared at the fire. They sat in silence for a long time. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was, she realized slowly, the silence of 2 people who have stopped performing for each other. Eventually she said, "I'm not going to run." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How?" He turned his head slightly, and the firelight caught the angle of his face, the jaw, the dark eyes. "Because you burned Halvard's letter." She stared at him. "You knew about that?" "I know most things." A silence. Then, "I didn't know you'd burn it in under a minute." She felt it happen before she could stop it, a sound that started in her chest and came out as laughter, real laughter, the kind she had not produced in so long that it sounded strange to her own ears, rusty at the edges, slightly too sharp, like a door opened that has been closed for too long. He looked at her when she laughed, and she saw it happen, what she had not seen since the beginning. The corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not quite, but the architecture of one. The structural possibility of warmth in a face that had forgotten how to arrange itself for it. She stopped laughing. The silence returned, different now, warmer by some degree. "Get some sleep," he said quietly. "Will you?" she said. He looked at the fire. "Probably not." "Then I won't either." She leaned her head back against the stone of the hearth. "But I'll sit here for a while, if that's acceptable." He did not say it was acceptable. He also did not leave. They sat by the fire in the last hour before the ceremony's eve became the ceremony's morning, and the snow fell outside, and the chest breathed its patient light between them, and Maren let herself rest. Not sleep, but rest, in the strange, unexpected warmth of not being alone. Chapter 8. The Ceremony. She dressed herself on the morning of the ceremony. She had asked Sigrid to help her. Sigrid was awake and on the mend, sitting up in the healer's rooms with the particular focused fury of someone who had been knocked down and was cataloging exactly who to be angry at. But Sigrid had taken her hands and held them and said, "You should do this yourself. I'll be watching from the side of the hall. I'll be watching when you walk in." So, Maren dressed herself in the room with the stone hearth and the window overlooking the mountains, and the iron chest sitting on the table beside the washstand like a thing that knew what today was. The dress had been brought in the night before. not by court attendants, but by Lucas himself, who had come to the door at near midnight with a plain linen package and handed it to her without explanation and left before she could respond. She had opened it by firelight. White, the same shade as the dress she'd worn to the choosing, but finer. Not fine in the way of ceremony gowns, heavy with embroidery and symbolic weight, but fine in the way of something made for a specific person, the weave close and clean, the cut plain and well-made. A dress that said, herself. Not performing. Not costumed. Her. She had understood what he was telling her. She braided her own hair, the way her mother had taught her, before fever, in the mornings when the world was cold and simple, and she left it loose at the ends, because that was how it wanted to be. She had no jewelry, no crown, no adornment. She put on the dress, and she put on her own face, and she looked at herself once in the cold surface of the polished silver mirror on the wall. A girl from the low pack, standing where she was never supposed to stand. She picked up the chest. It was warm in her arms, its light breathing at the seams. She breathed with it, once, deliberately. Then she walked to the ceremony. The great hall was fuller than she had ever seen it, which was the same thing as saying fuller than any space she had ever been in, because she had never been in a full hall before these last few days, and even those had not been like this. The ceremony had drawn not just Nordheim's own wolves, but delegates from 6 allied settlements, foreign observers, the official witnesses required by law, and the general population of the settlement, packed into every available space, outside in the courtyard where screens had been erected against the snow so that those who could not fit inside could hear. Hundreds of people. They all looked at her when she entered. She walked the length of the hall as she had practiced, not the ceremonial presentation walk with its prescribed pacing and precise angles, but simply walked because she had decided in the last hour that her version of this was going to be exactly that. Simple, present, unremarkable in the way of things that are too real to perform. She walked, and she held the chest, and she kept her chin level, and she met the eyes of no one in particular, and everyone generally. The crowd was not quiet. It was the specific charged silence of a crowd that wants to be loud but is containing itself, because the moment has a quality of significance that even contempt doesn't want to disrupt. She could feel the opinions of the room like weather, the hostility, the curiosity, the calculation, the small pockets of something that might be called uncertainty. She could feel Halvard Strand's attention from the front row, focused and still and watching. She reached the altar. Lucas was there. He was dressed for ceremony, the same black and iron, but formal now, with the deep wolf skull sigil of the Nordheim throne on his chest and the fur cloak pinned at both shoulders, and his face carrying that quality she had come to recognize as his public face, not cold, exactly, but sealed. Present without invitation. The face he wore for the world. He looked at her when she reached the altar. Not the quick glance she had received at dinner, not the measuring look of the choosing. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the war room at midnight, with the attention of a man who has stopped calculating and started simply seeing. She looked back. The iron chest was on the table between them. He had placed his own copy there, and now she set hers beside it and understood that there was only one, that the chest she had been carrying these last days and the chest he had brought to the choosing were the same object, moved as needed, never truly separate from either of them. The head elder Gunnar moved to the center of the dais. He was not happy. She could read the political displeasure radiating from him like cold from stone, but he was here, and he was bound by law to conduct the ceremony, and he was too much of an institutionalist to let personal objection prevent an official proceeding. He began the recitation. The ancient words of the Alpha's binding ceremony rolled through the hall, the old tongue that hadn't been used in common speech for 200 years, but which she now understood, which she understood in a way she had not known she would, which settled into her body with the particular resonance of a language that had been waiting in her bones all along. She watched Lucas during the recitation. He stood still and formal and present, and once, just once, she saw him breathe. Halvard Strand was in the front row, 2 seats from the center. He was watching the chest. The recitation ended. Gunnar raised his voice. The binding waits. The Alpha King may present the covenant gift. Lucas stepped forward. He held up one hand. Not dramatically, not performatively, simply. Stop. the gesture of a man who has decided what comes next. The hall went silent.
He stepped to the chest.
His hand rested on the lid for a moment, one moment, in which she could see something move through his face, some private accounting, some last weighing, and then he looked at her. "This belongs to you," he said, quietly, for her, though it carried to every corner of the hall. He opened the chest. Chapter 9. The Gift That Silenced Nordheim. The light was the first thing. Not the orange-gold light she had seen pulsing at the seams these last days. That light had been contained, patient, held. This was different. When the lid opened, the light expanded outward through the hall in a single, silent pulse. The way light moves when something that has been sealed for a very long time is finally open to the air.
It was not blinding.
It was simply present, warm and golden and old, with a particular quality of things preserved over centuries, carrying in its texture the weight of the time it had endured. The hall breathed, or rather, the hall held its breath, which amounted to the same physical silence. Maren looked into the chest. The first thing she saw was the mantle. It was folded, ancient wolf pelt, white as new snow with time and preservation, so fine and close in its weave that it looked almost like cloth. She recognized the cut of it from the descriptions in the first pack histories she had been taught. The ceremonial mantle of the Alpha Queen, worn at founding ceremonies, worn at the binding of the first pack bond, preserved with what was clearly a power she had not known how to name until now. It glowed faintly, the same warm light that had been in the chest, now given shape, now given texture, now given the specific authority of an object that has been waiting for its owner. The second thing was the scroll. It was sealed, dark red, the wax bearing the original first pack sigil, the one that predated even the Nordheim wolf skull, a simpler mark, 3 lines crossing, the first written symbol of the founding bloodline. She knew it from the chest's carvings. She knew it from her father's papers. She knew it from her father's ring. The ring he had worn on his right hand, always, which she had thought was a family heirloom in the ordinary sense, which she had not known until this moment was a lineage seal. She stood very still. Lucas picked up the scroll and broke the seal with a single clean motion and unrolled it, and held it up before the court. The genealogy was written in first pack script, the old tongue, the letters she had traced by firelight on the chest surface, the letters her father had taught her as a game, and it ran in a careful, dense hand down the full length of the parchment, generation by generation, name by name, the unbroken line of the first pack bloodline from Nordheim's founding to its last recorded bearer. The final name, written in a different hand, fresher, less formal, the hand of a man writing quickly under pressure, was Eirik Mikkelsen. And below it, in the same hand, added with what she could see even from across the table, was extreme care, his daughter's name. Her name, Maren. She heard it happen in the room before she fully processed what she was seeing. A sound, not a gasp, not a shout, but the specific collective sound of a large group of people encountering information that rearranges the fundamental architecture of what they thought they knew. It moved through the hall like a current from the front row backward, the understanding traveling person by person the way understanding does in crowds, unevenly in clusters, and then all at once. Halvard Strand's face, in the front row, went white, not the white of shock. The white of a man watching something collapse that he has spent decades and a fortune keeping upright. Elder Gunnar made a sound that she could not categorize, something between reverence and a man who has just discovered he has been on the wrong side of a significant history. She understood it. All of it. In the space of 5 seconds. The chess game Lucas had been playing for 3 years. The patience of it. The architecture of it. The way he had allowed Halvard's rumor to circulate precisely because the rumor named the relics as stolen, and so when the chest opened, and they were revealed as authentic and present and irrefutably hers, the rumor became its own undoing. Halvard had described the objects. They were here. They were hers. He had provided the provenance himself. She thought, you brilliant, infuriating, complicated man. Lucas set the scroll down on the table. He picked up the mantle, gently, with both hands, the same way you carry something old and irreplaceable, and he turned to her. And then Lucas Tegan, Alpha King of Nordheim, the most feared ruler in 3 generations, the man who had not smiled in 7 years, the man who had carried this alone for 3 of them, went to one knee. Before her, before the court, before Halvard Strand and Elder Gunnar and the delegates and the warriors and the full weight of Nordheim's assembled power. He knelt. "I chose you," he said, and his voice was steady and carrying and meant for the room, and also, underneath all of that, meant entirely for her. Because the chest chose you. Because it would only open for the rightful queen, the blood heir of the first pack, the last daughter of the founding line. And because I have known who you were for 3 years, and spent 3 years ensuring you would be safe enough to find. He held the mantle up to her. "I did not choose you because of your bloodline," he said, and now his voice dropped, and it was for her only, in the way that some things said in public are nonetheless entirely private. "I chose you because when I watched you, in the tannery, in the council chambers, in the corridors of this stronghold, I saw someone who had survived everything the world had done to her and had not become cruel from it. I chose you because of who you are. The bloodline is the proof the court required. You were already my choice." The hall was absolutely, completely silent. Then the first elder knelt. It was Elder Astrid, her tutor, the old she-wolf who had spent the morning teaching her wolf law and had told her she had the mind of a strategist, who went to her knees first, without ceremony, simply as a statement of where she stood. Then 3 warriors in the front row. Then Gunnar, slowly, with the gravity of an old man making an irreversible decision. Then the delegates from the allied settlements, one by one, understanding what they were witnessing and what it meant for the alliances that had depended on the first pack line's existence for 2 centuries. Then behind them, the pack. Wave by wave, person by person, Nordheim knelt. Halvard Strand did not kneel. He sat in his chair in the front row with the stillness of a man surrounded by guards who have just realized they're surrounding him, and his face was the face of someone doing the arithmetic of what comes next. Maren looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the mantle from Lucas's hands. It settled around her shoulders as though it had been waiting for exactly these shoulders, as though 2 centuries of waiting had given it a knowledge of her shape. It was warm. Not the warmth of a garment, but the warmth of a thing that recognizes you, the warmth of arrival. She stood in the white mantle over her simple linen dress, in her own braided hair, with no jewels and no crown and no performance, and she was the last daughter of the first pack bloodline, and she was the girl from the tannery, and she was both of these things at once, and she was going to stop apologizing for taking up space. Nordheim knelt before her. She looked out over all of them. The warriors, the elders, the court, the crowd packed into every corridor and courtyard, and she felt, for the first time in her life, the thing she had not known was missing. She felt found. Chapter 10. What she carries now. Halvard Strand was arrested before the ceremony's end. It was not dramatic. There were no shouts, no struggle, no prolonged confrontation. 2 of the king's guards stepped forward from the sides of the hall, and the evidence that had been inside the sealed chest included, alongside the genealogy and the mantle, 3 additional documents, letters, dated 7 years ago, in Halvard's father's hand, detailing the conspiracy against Eirik Mikkelsen, the manufactured treason charge, the names of the council members who had been bribed to support it, the agreement between 3 allied families to share the Mikkelsen assets after the execution. It was, as Lucas had told her in the war room, irrefutable. The arrest was quiet and efficient, and Halvard went with the particular dignity of a man who has lost and knows it and is deciding how to manage the loss. He did not look at Maren as they took him out. She watched him go and felt, in place of the satisfaction she might have expected, something quieter and more complex, the particular feeling of a wound being cleaned, which is not comfortable but is the necessary precondition for healing. Lena Strand, his daughter, remained in the hall. She stood in her chair with an expression that had moved, over the course of the last hour, through fury and calculation, and had arrived, Maren thought, at something approaching assessment. Lena was smart. Maren had understood this immediately, from the way she moved through court, from the quality of her silences. Smart enough to understand that the world had changed, and that adapting was more valuable than resistance. Their eyes met once, briefly. Neither of them looked away first. It was not a declaration of peace. It was a mutual acknowledgement of ongoing complexity, which was a more honest beginning. The formal ceremony concluded. The elder who had knelt first, Astrid, completed the binding recitation in a voice that shook only slightly with what Maren recognized as emotion kept strictly on Elise. The legal witnesses signed the record. The hall slowly began to move, the contained energy of a crowd that had witnessed something significant and needed to process it through motion and conversation. Sigrid appeared at her side. She was pale, still moving carefully, her morning's ordeal written in the set of her shoulders and the lines around her eyes. But she was there, upright and present, having apparently decided that recovering in bed was less important than witnessing this, and when she looked at Maren, she was smiling. "Well," she said. "Well," Maren agreed. Sigrid took her hand and held it briefly, just once, and then released it, not because the moment was over, but because it was complete. The formal wedding took place 3 days later. Not the ceremony in the hall, that had been the legal binding, the public proof, the declaration that could not be undone. The formal wedding was smaller, quieter, conducted in the elders' hall before the 6 senior witnesses required by law and no one else. No court. No crowd. No audience for whom anything needed to be performed. Just Maren and Lucas, and the words that meant something. There was a moment during the ceremony where the ritual required the binding pledge, the formal declaration of intention, the words that Wolf law required to be spoken freely and without compulsion, a provision that dated back to the first Pax Charter specifically to prevent forced bondings. The elder recited the statutory language. Lucas turned to her. He did not say the pledge immediately. He looked at her first, a real look, the kind she had learned to read over the last week, the look that meant, "I see you, I am asking, I am waiting." Then he said, "May I take your hand?" She had noticed this. She would always notice this. In a room full of ancient formality, surrounded by the weight of law and ceremony and 2 centuries of consequence, he had asked, not taken, not assumed. "Yes," she said. He took her hand. His was large and warm and roughened from years of everything a man becomes over years of responsibility and weather and war, and hers was roughened from years of brine and hides and the particular labor of survival, and they were, she thought, a matched pair in this specific way, both of them worn down to the essential by the things they had endured, both of them still here. They said the words. The elder pronounced the binding, and it was done, and it was real, and nothing about it felt like a funeral. It was past midnight when they found themselves on the battlements. This had not been planned. They had both arrived there separately, as people do when they're not ready to be indoors but need to think, and had found each other at the northern parapet, where the mountains were closest, and the snow fell in wide, slow curtains that turned the world soft. The torches along the wall were low. The settlement below them was quiet, not the held-breath quiet of ceremony, but the real quiet of a place that has settled. They stood side by side and looked at Nordheim spread below them, the settlement lights, the tree line, the mountains beyond, the kingdom vast and cold, and for the first time in a long time, at some kind of peace. She said, "Why did you wait 3 years?" She had asked this before in fragments. She asked it again here because here, in the quiet, after everything, she wanted the answer she hadn't been ready to hear before. He was quiet for a long moment. The snow fell. "When I found the records," he said, "you were 16. You were at the tannery. You had no idea who you were, and you were safe, because the people who would have wanted to hurt you were certain you were nobody." He paused. "If I had come to you then, if I had told you, or tried to reveal it, or moved before the time was right, Halvard would have known. He has eyes in this court that I only fully mapped in the last 2 years. And he would have moved to eliminate you before the proof could be presented." Another pause. "I had to wait until I could do it safely. Until I could do it right." "You could have told me," she said. "At some point in those 3 years. You could have sent word. Something." "Yes." He did not defend this. "I could have. I chose not to because I convinced myself that you were safer not knowing, and because—" He stopped. She waited. "Because knowing would have changed how you carried yourself, and I needed you to walk into that hall as exactly what you are. And I knew if you had known, you would have been performing something rather than simply being it. She considered this. It was strategic and it was honest, and it was also, underneath those things, something else. Were you afraid? She said. He looked at her.
That I wouldn't choose this, she said.
That if you told me the truth and gave me a choice, I would say no. The longest pause. The snow fell between the torchlight and the darkness. Yes, he said. She looked at him. This man, this terrifying and complicated and patient and privately devoted man who had spent 3 years building a system to protect a girl he had never spoken to, and who had apparently somewhere in those 3 years forgotten to account for the fact that he might have also been afraid. She thought about what it had taken to do that. To watch someone from a distance, to keep them safe without their knowledge, to wait without knowing the outcome, to hold the thing you were hoping for lightly enough that it didn't crush you if it didn't come. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, immediately, without hesitation, as if they had been waiting for the same reason the chest had been waiting, as if this too was a thing that had been sealed and was now, finally, opening. The chest was never the gift, she said. He looked at her. The chest was proof. Evidence. A legal instrument. She turned to look at him. The gift was a king who believed I was worth waiting for, who spent 3 years making sure I could walk into a room and be safe. She held his gaze. That's what you gave me. He looked at her for a long time. She watched his face do the thing she had first seen in the war room at midnight, the careful, rusty, long-unused architecture of warmth, finding its way back to a surface that had forgotten it. He didn't smile. He didn't say anything. He simply tightened his hand around hers, and they stood on the battlements together in the snow while Nordheim stretched out before them, vast and cold and ancient and theirs. She had spent 19 years being nobody. She had spent the last week becoming someone. Standing here, in the dark, in the falling snow, with her hand in the hand of the most feared man in the territory, she understood for the first time what it felt like to have arrived somewhere, not at a destination planned for her, not at a role assigned to her, but at herself. At the specific, irreducible, undeniable fact of who she was. The Alpha Queen of Nordheim. The last daughter of the first pack line. The girl from the tannery who had survived and survived and survived until surviving became something else entirely. Maren Mikkelsen. She took up space. She intended to keep doing it. Below them, Nordheim breathed in the snow. The mountains held their old, patient shapes against the sky. The torches burned. And at last, after 7 years, after 3 years, after all the years of waiting on both sides of a distance neither of them had known how to cross, the Alpha King of Nordheim turned to the girl beside him, and he smiled.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.